What a magnificent service we had on Easter. Beautiful music, the flowers, the pageantry, and what a message. The resurrection story teaches us that stones we thought were impossible to move can be moved away. Allison, I have to say that last Sunday's Easter service was the first one in which that opened with the instructions to rise, turn, and face the rear end. Is that some kind of idol worship there? I don't know. Last fall, we on the Stewardship Committee were looking for a program for the Pledge Campaign. We all talked about the fact that stewardship, when we think about stewardship, we think about raising money. But what about the other tenets of stewardship? Time, talent, and prayer. Raising money is important, and absolutely, and should be the primary focus of that committee, but as a church and as individuals, so is our commitment to God. One of the programs that were recommended to us was FIRST, Putting God First in Living and Giving, and it was based on Mike Slaughter's book, Shiny Gods, Finding Freedom from the Things That Distract Us. We all read the book and found the message to be simple and powerful and something to be shared with all of you. The program calls for members of all ages to get involved with the stewardship movement. We wanted to come back and revisit it with the congregation because we are called to be stewards of God's world all year long. The book is broken into 4 main chapters. Number 1, naming our idols, which I'm talking about today. Number 2, money, work, and debt. Number 3, be faithful, save, and give. And number 4, heart giving. Mike Slaughter's definition of an idol is anything or anyone that receives the primary focus of my energy or resources, which should first belong to God. He goes on to say, the Bible calls this a divided heart. The concepts of idols is an old one. It's easy to rattle off several cultures throughout the world and history which have revolved around the worship of idols. In today's scripture reading, an Old Testament verse, God says, "Don't forget the covenant I made with you. Don't worship other gods. Instead, worship only the Lord your God. He will rescue you from your enemies' powers." But they wouldn't listen. When I was in the 7th grade, we had excellent Sunday school teachers, 2 couples, the Groves and the Hatchers. Mr. Groves was a captain with American Airlines and was a very charismatic speaker and was sort of our lead teacher. He had a son in our class and related to us very well. The class was basically an Old Testament survey class that walked us through the Old Testament in preparation for the 8th grade class, which would walk us through the New Testament. He really brought the stories to life for us and made it fun to learn by quizzing us every few weeks with a rousing game of Old Testament baseball, where you'd get to base if you answered the question right. He made it fun to learn. He mapped out the biblical world in the classroom and would talk about SALT, which stood for Sarah, Abraham, Lot, and Terah. And he talked about their journey through the Fertile Crescent and what happened to Lot's wife when she looked back at Sodom, where she turned into salt. And he talked about Kadesh Barnea, which he called Katie's Barn. He said, and they all went out and wandered around Katie's Barn. Kadesh Barnea was the chief site of encampment for the Israelites during their time in the wilderness, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. Time and time again, he would impress upon us how God took care of the Israelites, and that when times were tough, they would stay on the straight and narrow and be diligent in their worship of God, but once God had rescued them, they would forget. They'd fall off the path and forget about God until some other catastrophe overtook them. We'd listen and think to ourselves, with the smug superiority of 12 and 13-year-olds, those silly Israelites, they just didn't get it. Several years went by before I understood that we are no better today. Back to 2 Kings. So these nations worship the Lord, but they also serve their idols. The children and the grandchildren are doing the very same thing their parents did, and that's how things still are today. The LA riots, the Northridge earthquake, 9/11. I can't speak for anyone else, but I certainly renewed my covenant with God after each of those events. In the last few years, my parents have been downsizing, and my mother sent me a packet of letters that I had written to them over the years, thinking that Jackson someday may appreciate them. It's too bad today with all the social media and oversharing of personal information that we don't take the time to write letters anymore. One of the letters that I wrote was one that I wrote to them the day after the Northridge earthquake. As I was preparing for this morning, I reached for a box which I thought held a study Bible but instead it was full of letters, including that one, an excerpt. January 18th, 1994. Dear Mama and Daddy, it scares me to think how hard my guardian angel has been working the last couple of months. I sit here listening to the news, and the death toll has now reached 34. And I'm excited that my monitor is still working after its ill-fated attempt to fly. I spend a few paragraphs describing the state of my apartment and the fact that I didn't have enough batteries for the portable radio, but that I did have plenty of flashlights. And then I say, it was kind of fun to stand out in the middle of Hudson Avenue and look up the stars. You could even see the Big Dipper. I wonder when the last time you could stand and look up in Hollywood and see real stars, not the two-legged variety. It was a pretty sight and a big reminder that we're not as almighty as we think we are, which reminds me of a story they had on the news today. They were talking to a man who lives in Studio City whose home was pretty much destroyed by the quake. He said that all of his books were in a jumbled heap and covered in dust, except for one. He pointed down, and the camera panned down to a book with a brightly colored dust jacket, which read, Teaching Your Children About God's Love. The man said that he told his wife he guessed it was a pretty important lesson. Even the babbling reporter shut up. So these nations worship the Lord, but they also serve their idols. The children and the grandchildren are doing the very same thing their parents did, and that's how things still are today. We all have things in our lives which distract us from our relationship with God. Sports, eating out, technology, material possessions, family. For me, a big one is work. Trying to find a work-life balance. Where is my faith? Where does faith fit into that? In a world full of cultural idols, there is no downtime. We were standing in line at the Trader Joe's the other day, and Doug picked up a card, read it, and handed it to me. It had a picture of a hound dog sprawled out on the porch on the front, and inside it said, "Never underestimate the power of doing nothing." I can't remember the last time I did nothing. Mike Slaughter says, in our idolatry, we have allowed ourselves to become the center of our universe. The first time I knew that God spoke directly to me was on this very subject. I was a junior in college, and there was some big party that everyone was going to go to. I was afraid of going. I was standing in front of my mirror, throwing myself a real pity party. I didn't think that anybody liked me and that maybe it would just be better off for me and everybody else if I just stayed at home by myself. And as I stood in front of that mirror, a voice said, "Fine, stay here, but understand that you are on the ultimate ego trip." What? I was stunned. The voice went on to say, "If you think people will notice you aren't there, you are sadly mistaken. You can stay here and feel sorry for yourself, or you can go and ask someone how they're doing. Maybe they need someone to talk to." Well, that was life-changing for me. The last time I was up here speaking to you, I shared a story that happened when I was working at the La Jolla Playhouse. Today, I'd like to share another. It's about an actor named James Rebhorn. Jim was in a production that I stage managed the second season I was at the Playhouse. He was married to a former stage manager who had just been given the directorship of a women's shelter in New Jersey where they lived. He was very proud of her. They had 2 very young daughters. In fact, one of them was still a baby. Jim was making the transition from being a soap actor into movies, and he continued to do work on the stage. When he arrived in La Jolla, I think he was struggling with where he was in his life. He was raised a Lutheran and a man of strong faith, but his wife had a job where she was making a difference. They had these 2 beautiful little girls, and acting isn't the steadiest of professions. We found that we had a lot in common, and he became sort of a mentor to me. He even tried to teach me how to play cribbage. Yeah. One day, I was lamenting the fact that I didn't think I was making as much of my life as my parents had of theirs. After all, my father's first bed had been a drawer nailed to the wall. Both of them had gone on to have very successful careers. I was almost 30, and I needed to get on the ball if I was going to keep up with them. He cut me off and said, "Your parents' life is their life. Yours is yours. It's on its own timeline. You can't compare the two. You don't know what you're supposed to do. Your parents' only wish is for you to try and always do your best." When Becky and the girls came out to stay once the show was open and they had some time to spend together as a family, she pulled me aside and thanked me for my support of him. Jim passed away on March 21st of this year after a long battle with melanoma. I discovered this when I opened up my web browser, and there was the headline, "James Rebhorn, actor on Homeland, dead at 65. He wrote his own obituary in which he said, in speaking to his children made him immensely proud. Their dedication to improving our species and making the world a better place gave him hope for the future. They deal with grief differently, and they should each manage it as they see fit. He hopes, however, they will grieve his passing only as long as necessary. They have good work to do, and they should get busy doing it. Time is flying by." In Shiny Gods, we are asked to do a heart check on our priorities. The first indicator of what we truly worship is how we spend our time. The second indicator is our bank statement or checkbook. Money is one of the truest indicators of faith. What Jesus calls living abundantly comes when Christ is the center and deciding factor in everything in our lives. Mr. Slaughter closes his chapter on naming our idols by saying, "We have to pay attention to the divided heart issue. When we pursue the shiny gods of culture, we spend our lives conjugating 3 words: to want, to have, to achieve. Jesus leads us to a better way. He tells us to conjugate 1 word: to love. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Your time, your talent, your treasures, and your prayers." We at First Church once again are headed into a period of transition. Over the next few weeks, as we step through this study on stewardship and as we say goodbye to Reverend DePano and his family and welcome a new lead pastor, let us remember that we are Easter people. And in the words of the song in the songbook for saints and sinners, Every morning is Easter morning from now on. Every day is Resurrection Day. The past is over and gone. And we should remember Dr. Bridgeforth's Easter message, beware of they. And remember, the resurrection story teaches us that stones we thought were impossible to move can be moved away. Amen.